It's been just over a year since Rolex gave us a brand new generation of Daytona. But of course, like most modern Daytonas, it's still been very difficult to get, which makes it even harder to get the two side by side to be able to show what are actually the differences between these two models. But luckily today we managed to do that, and we're going to be looking at the differences between the new and the old generation Daytonas, because like most Rolex updates, the changes are subtle, but put together and seen side by side, it does make a huge difference. So starting out with the most obvious difference between the new Daytona and the old one, you need to take a look at the bezel. You'll see that on the newer Daytonas, they have this metallic ring around the ceramic bezel. Now this is a callback to vintage Daytonas, which would have had a similar look, but obviously in those days it would have been a metal insert surrounded by a contrasting metal ring. But this is the easiest way that you can tell if you're looking at a current generation Daytona with the 1265 generation, or if you don't see this ring, you know you're looking at one of the older ones from the 1165 generation. Moving on though, the next difference again is also vintage evocative, and that is the indices. The indices on the newer Daytonas are all just a little bit slimmer, and this again is a callback to older Daytonas, but in this case they're harking back to the Zenith Daytona of the early 90s. Ironically, this is the generation that really brought about the current design language in the Daytona, so it is fitting that this is brought over onto the new ones. This also serves the added benefit of just adding a little bit more room on the dial, which is a recurring theme as you'll see throughout some of the other differences between the old and the new Daytona. Continuing on the dial script itself is also a little bit smaller. Rolex still insists on putting 5 lines of text at the 12 o'clock, however it is a little bit smaller, and again this allows the dial a little bit more room to breathe compared to the older generation, which can be a little bit cluttered, especially with that much text. The next change is that they also slim down the chapter rings, so the little rings surrounding the main registers are just that little bit slimmer, again giving a little bit more of that feeling of having some more space. This is much more apparent when you look at something like the Panda Daytona, however you can still get a little bit of that feel of openness even when you look at these fully colored subdials in comparison to an older one. But the changes aren't just on the dial and on the bezel. One of the biggest changes that Rolex made in going through to the 1265 generation was that they finally made the lugs symmetrical. One of the biggest criticisms of the previous generation Daytonas was that they had these asymmetrical lugs. On the 3 o'clock side, the lugs were always a little bit thicker than they are on the 9 o'clock side. In the new generation though, Rolex has created more symmetry in this, and it just creates for an overall more balanced look on the watch. That asymmetry on the previous generation for many people was one of those things that once you see it, you can't really unsee it. Rolex has managed to iron out that wrinkle, and now the watch is much more balanced as a result. And then the last difference that I'd like to highlight, and this is the reason why we decided to showcase 2 Oysterflex ones instead of 2 on the bracelet, is the clasp. Right away when you look at the two watches, you can see that the clasp is noticeably longer on the new generation. And this is because the new generation actually features the Glidelock that was originally shown on the Submariner. This adds a lot of flexibility in terms of sizing, and also means that Rolex can limit the number of different sizes for the Oysterflex compared to the various sizes they had on the older generation. So with this you can actually extend it about 1.5 centimeters on the fly without any tools, and it means you can achieve that perfect fit even better than you could before. True, the previous one did have the Easy Link, but this only adds a small amount of flexibility, but the trade-off is that you do end up with a shorter clasp, which is a little bit more elegant perhaps. And then the very last change, which is one that you can't see on the outside, is that of course Rolex updated the movement. Now the movement on the Daytona was already very advanced, so Rolex didn't have to go too far, but what they did do is they added a lot of the new features that they developed over the 23 years since they introduced their first in-house caliber, and the biggest one of those is the introduction of the Chronext escapement, which allows the watch to be a little bit more efficient as well as a little bit more accurate. So it continues to meet Rolex's superlative chronometer standard. But at the end of the day, both of these are 2 highly desirable watches. Even after being discontinued, the Daytona from the 1165 generation continues to be one of the most sought after watches within the watch industry, and with good reason. It's perfectly proportioned, it's an iconic watch that's instantly recognizable, and at practically every level it continues to be a watch that sells over retail and that's difficult to get at an authorized dealer. Luckily here at Chronext, we're able to source these both new and pre-owned, so make sure you check the links in the description below if you're after a Daytona. Now that you can see the differences, do you prefer the newer one with its more open look to the dial, or do you prefer the older generation, which has a bit more presence, the shorter clasp, and a little bit more happening on the dial? We'd love to know your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this video, then make sure you like it and share it. If you want to see more videos about watches, then make sure you subscribe to the channel, and we even have a Rolex playlist that you can check out if you want to see more specific Rolex content. Thanks for joining us on this quick exploration of the differences between the old and the new Daytona, and we look forward to seeing you on the next video.